Okay. Hey, folks. All right, lots of
Hey,
folks are on
everyone.
time today. That's great. We're going to give it a couple minutes to let everybody filter in and get settled before we get started here. But the chat is turned on. Say hi. Let us know where you're calling in from.
Yep. Hello, Alex. Hello, Andrew. Hello, Caroline. Daniel, David, Fabian, so many people. Hello, everybody.
People are joining too fast to see all
Yeah,
of them.
I'm trying to read everyone, but it's hard.
You're already behind.
Hi, Scott. Hi, Oleg. How you doing?
One note of housekeeping for folks, Zoom will default your chat to send messages to only hosts and panelists, which means just the three of us can see them. You'll want to change that to everyone so that everyone can see you say hi.
Hi, Alexei. Nice to meet you. Bonjour. Some people speak French now.
We're not doing the webinar in French.
No, we're not.
Maybe tomorrow you know a little bit of French, right? Or you're like, maybe?
Well, for the amount of years that I had French in school, I know very little, but I can usually piece it together when I'm listening, but it's not great when I'm speaking. Like, I think Mark would hate it having to listen to me speak French.
No, I won't say that. I won't say that.
You would do better than I would. So
Hey,
maybe someday
Ben.
we'll have webinars in other languages. Hey, Victor, it's good to see you. Happy New Year.
Yeah, one day I can do Airflow 101 in German.
Yep, we should try that. I mean, I won't, but if you want to try.
We can do the French version and the German version.
There we go. Hey, Tracy. Hi, everybody. It's so exciting to see you for real. It's been a while.
All right, for folks who are just joining, we're gonna give it maybe one more minute before we get started here. We're still picking up quite a lot, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Yes, I will go through some housekeeping in just a minute here, but this is being recorded, so I'm gonna housekeeping sneak peek. It'll be available to you afterwards for sure. All right, let me just find the right screen here. Pull this up. Okay. All right, we're at 3 after. We're still having some folks join, but we've got a lot to get through today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with some of our housekeeping and stuff to get started before we dive into the content today. So thanks everybody for joining. Happy New Year. This is our first webinar of 2024, and we're very excited to have you. If this is your first astronomer webinar, this is a great one to join. And obviously I've already seen lots of folks in the chat, some familiar names. So thank you for joining again. Before we dive into the content today, which we're very excited about, we always like to start with a couple of community updates just to let you know about stuff that's going on with the Airflow project and in the Airflow community. Things have already kicked off at a very fast pace for 2024, so there's a lot to cover here. Lots of upcoming community events I want to make you aware of. This is just a sampling. There are obviously virtual events going on all the time, including webinars like this one. We'll have another webinar next week on managing connections in Airflow, which is a very frequently requested topic. We've never done a webinar on that specifically before. So if that's something you're interested in, we would love to see you there. We're going to throw links to all of this stuff in the chat. Later in January, Snowflake is hosting a virtual snowpark day. There's lots of great content around snowpark, and Tamara, who is here on the webinar today, is giving a talk there on using snowpark in Airflow. So if you are a Snowflake user, definitely check that out. And then Airflow meetups are back in a lot of cities. These are a great way to in-person meet fellow Airflow users in the places where you live. So there's one coming up in Sao Paulo. I guess it's the first one there. So that's super exciting. We know there's a big Airflow community in Brazil that's going to be in February. If you are interested in Airflow meetups and are not living in Sao Paulo, feel free to give a shout, reach out to us in the Airflow Slack, and we can see if we can help out with that. Content spotlight today, we've got lots of 2.8 content. We're going to be throwing links to all of this in the chat. So sneak peek into our main content today, we are going to be covering what's new in the 2.8 release, and we've got tons of both written resources and video stuff for you after the fact if you want to learn more post-webinar. Okay, a couple of offers for everybody. So anybody who joins today, we are giving you a code for a free Airflow certification. If you are newer to Airflow or an advanced user and haven't taken the certification yet, this is a great thing to put on your resume. This was designed by Mark and his team at Astronomer. It's very, very good. It's a great way to get started. All of the educational content to prepare for the exam is free for everybody, but we've got the code for you so that you can take the exam as a thank you for joining us today. Oops. So we will throw that in the chat. Also, if you're looking for a way to run Airflow and try out all of the stuff that we covered today, you can always start a free trial of Astronomer's managed Airflow service, Astro, and that is available for you. Again, we will throw links to those in the chat. Final community update that I have for you. The Airflow Summit for 2024 has been set, or I should say the dates have been set. This will be happening in September of this year in San Francisco. That seems like a ways away, but especially if you are traveling from outside of the US, now is a great time to start thinking about it. Set those dates aside. The one in 2023 was really fun. We love seeing folks in person, and we would love to see you there. You can sign up for updates on the Airflow Summit webpage so that when more information like the venue and tickets and CFP and all of that become available, you can make sure that you know right away. So, okay, I think that is it for community updates. Going to go ahead and jump into the content today. And we are super, super excited to announce the release of Airflow 2.8. That is the topic for our webinar. A couple of bits of housekeeping before we get started. This is being recorded, and you will get an email with a link to the recording after the webinar. So if you want to rewatch, share it with your colleagues, any of that, that will be available to you, as well as all of the code that we go through. Chat is turned on, as you've probably seen. Please ask questions. We will have time for Q&A at the end. You can use Zoom's Q&A feature or throw stuff in the chat. And we've got a whole group of us here today to help answer as we're presenting. Obviously, very excited to have Tamara from my team on, who you have probably seen in previous webinars, to go through our demo of 2.8 today. And Mark Lamberti, who I've seen in the chat, a lot of you are also familiar with, who's done a ton of great work for the Airflow community. So we are all here and excited to talk about this new release. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Airflow 2.8 was released in December, so a couple of weeks ago now. But I hope that everybody here is already familiar with Airflow at least a little bit. But as you'll know, it's a super popular tool. It's experienced huge growth over the last couple of years and has a really strong community and lots of contributors that keep up this very frequent pace of new releases. We do webinars like this for every new Airflow release. They're one of my favorite types to do. New Airflow releases that I would consider bigger releases, so minor releases at least, come out around once a quarter. So we had 4 last year, again, ending in 2.8 at the end of December. These tend to have big new features and lots of improvements that kind of change what you can do with Airflow. So it is great to keep up with what's going on in them. Releases, including those minor and patch releases, are super consistent in Airflow. I actually find this slide pretty hard to keep up to date. This is everything that has happened, in the last 2 years. So there's a ton going on in the Airflow project. It is not at all static. People are contributing new things all the time, and releases are super consistent. And we want you to be able to keep up with those. One of the reasons, as I said, is all of the new minor releases contain tons of great stuff. 2.8 was no exception. There are more than 20 new features included in 2.8. We're going to cover a good chunk of those today. There were also over 60 improvements. Improvements are things that are considered an existing feature, so something that was already in Airflow but now works either more efficiently or in a better way or has kind of expanded user functionality. So more than 60, that's a big number. There were also over 50 bug fixes. So one of the biggest reasons to upgrade, even if you're not writing new DAGs and need to take advantage of new features, which we hope you are, bugs are getting fixed in Airflow all the time. So it is very much in your best interest to stay up to date. In addition to, or I guess as part of the 50 bug fixes, in this release, there were 4 CVE fixes. We can find a link, I think, in a minute to those CVEs were published. So those are, again, critical vulnerabilities that you very much do not want your organization to be subject to. So one of the biggest reasons to always keep up to date with newer versions. So with that, that's our quick overview. I'm going to hand it over to Mark, who is going to walk through the specifics of some of the new features that we think you'll be excited about.
Thank you so much for this great introduction, Keaton. Well, I'm so excited. Welcome, everybody. Truly, I'm so excited to be there with you for this webinar for Airflow 2.8. Honestly, there are a couple of new features that I'm sure you will be truly excited about. And stay for the demo, because during the demo, you will see exactly how to put those features in practice, how to use them with DAGs. So I'm going to be a little bit brief, but not too much. So let's start with the first feature, which I believe is I think it's truly amazing, honestly, which is the object storage API. So I'm pretty sure that you know that we have some operators, like transfer operators, actually, from S3 to GCS, then GCS to S3. Then you have, like, I don't know, maybe S3 to Azure Blob and so on, right? Like, you have a ton of operators like that just to transfer data. And this is a bit annoying. And that's the beauty of the object storage API. Think of it as an abstraction that goes on top of those operators, right? And you don't care about the underlying object storages that you are interacting with. So basically, you will interact with your object storages exactly like if you were manipulating files. So that means no code change needed when you moving between S3, GCS, or other object storages. You will see that later that it's very Python native. Again, like, no need to use an operator and so on. Honestly, I love the way to do that. Then last but not least, you can even use alternative backends such as FTP, SFTP, and more. And actually, let me show you on the next slide how to, like, what are the possibilities with that. So the first one is obviously ETL and ELT. So moving data between object storage locations will be much easier than before with that new API. Then machine learning, if you want to move files from ingest to train test, input to archive, and so on. And the reason why it is useful for machine learning is because now you will be able to stream large files with this object storage API. Indeed, you have some very nice improvements that you can benefit from in order to stream the data from one object storage to another one. And now on the next slide, you can see how to implement that a little bit. Again, you will see that in the demo. But the first thing that you need is to have the relevant Airflow provider installed. So for example, if you want to interact with S3, then you need the Amazon provider. If you want to interact with GCS, then you need the Google Cloud provider. And once you have that, the next step is to create a connection to connect to your object storage system. Otherwise, you cannot connect to it. So you need to create an Airflow connection, and then you do the import from Airflow IO path and object storage path. And as you can see in this little snippet, you see you just need to use object storage path. Then you pass the object storage you want to interact with and the path to your bucket. So just like that, base here is an object storage path, and you can interact with it exactly like if you were interacting with files in local. So honestly, I keep saying that, but you will see in the demo, it's truly amazing. So on the next slide, you have another feature that actually it's not a so well popular feature, but very useful. So maybe you don't know what is a dataset. So the first thing about datasets, a dataset is a group of logical data. So for example, think of a dataset as a representation or actually as a pointer to a table in a database, or as a pointer to a file in your local file system. So this is a data set. And now you have the concept of listeners. So a listener helps you to listen to events that happen in your Airflow instance. So for example, you could have a listener to know whenever something happens with your task instances or your DAG runs. And in this case, with 2.8, you have listeners to datasets. So now you can know whenever there is a dataset that it is changed or updated. And this is useful if you want notifications for when datasets have been updated, or when you want to trigger external processes based on datasets. For example, you have a task that updates a dataset, and that could trigger a Spark job externally. So that's the beauty of the datasets and the listeners. And if you don't know about the listeners, I strongly recommend you to take a look at the documentation of Airflow. Listeners are useful. On the next slide, and this is actually something that I'm pretty sure you already got. It's very annoying when you run a task and it doesn't work, right? Pretty annoying. And so the first thing to do is to take a look at the logs. So you go take a look at the logs of your task, and unfortunately, you don't know exactly why the task doesn't work. And the reason for that might be due to something else, something external to the task. For example, the scheduler or the executor. Well, guess what? Now in 2.8, you will be able to see those logs directly in the logs of your task. So that means you don't have to go checking out the logs of the scheduler or the executor. You can just take a look at the logs of your task, and that's it. And that will make your debugging much easier than before when your task fails due to something external to it. On the next slide, other significant changes, as you know, maybe you can put some descriptions. You can actually attach a description to your DAGs. I strongly recommend you to do that. Honestly, like, think of your teammates, right? You don't want to dive into a giant DAG to know what it does. So it's always a best practice to define a description to your DAG. So do that. And now for 2.8, before 2.8, actually, you were able to use raw HTML code. Now it is disabled by default. And the reason for that is, well, security reasons. And the last one is 3 new branching operators decorators. So what does that mean? You have like the branch Python virtual env operator, the branch external Python, and the branch virtual env. So the point of those branching operators is that now you can do branching, so select one task or another in a Python virtual environment. And the beauty of the Python virtual environments is that you won't end up with any dependency conflicts, right? Because you have all of your dependencies installed and running in a Python virtual environment, and that won't impact whatever you have installed on your system. So I strongly recommend you to take a look at the Python virtual env operator if you don't know it. Same thing with the external Python operator. And take a look at the branching operators here if you even want to do branching between different tasks in Python virtual environments. That will save you a lot of time, especially if you have different dependencies, the same dependencies, but with different versions. So that's it about a quick overview of the new features of 2.8. Now you will see the demo, and trust me, it's going to be amazing. So Tamara, the floor is yours.
All right. Let me share my screen. You should now see Airflow. See my Airflow DAX? Okay,
Yep.
Great. And I will also already put the link to all of the code that I'm going to show in the chat for people who want to follow along. So yeah, thank you so much, Mark. That was awesome. That was a great overview. And I will probably repeat a couple of things that you said, and I will show you how all of those features, what they can look like inside of your DAX. So you can see this Airflow environment here, and you can already see there's a lot of DAGs here in this repository that we prepared for you. And I will not have time to go through all of those. I think by that time, some of us are asleep, especially the people who are in further Eastern time zones. So I will just focus on a couple of DAGs, but if you want to have more examples of a feature or want to see how smaller features are implemented, then look at the repository. There's probably a DAG that shows that for you. All right, so I will select all of the DAGs that are tagged with webinar, so I don't get lost in this repository. And let's start with the object storage. And I will show a couple of DAGs for the object storage. First, I want to show you a quite simple implementation. So we have this DAG here. It's a very simple DAG. We only have 3 tasks. We first list some files in an object storage, and then we use that list of files to copy the files to our local environment. There, I will show you how to actually stream copy those files, what Mark mentioned in the slides earlier, and I will also read the file content and print it to the logs. One thing that isn't directly tied to Airflow 2.8, but I wanted to highlight here, in case you are newer to Airflow, you might be wondering what's up with those square brackets and the number. This means this task is dynamically mapped. So this task is defined, but for a varying number of inputs, because I'm saying, well, I never know how many files I will actually have at that location. Maybe one day I have 2, like in this case, maybe one day I have 5 or 0, and another day I have 1,000. And I definitely don't want to change my DAG code every single day. So what I did was I made this task dynamic to adapt and create mapped task instances, one for each file that is getting put into the task. Okay, so what does this look like in the code? Let's actually look at this in VS Code, which is where you edit your DAGs, or in your other favorite IDE. And this is the code for this DAG. First, we have our DAG description. I'm highlighting this because Mark just mentioned it. You should never leave your DAGs without a description. Your colleagues will love you if you have a descriptive way to tell them how to interact with your DAG. And this can be markdown, so you can even have links. I will show you a little bit a more advanced description in a bit. But this is the description, and the way I added it to the DAG is by setting docmd to __ doc__. All right, so back to 2.8. We have this object storage path class. This is new, that we import from airflow.io.path. This is part of core Airflow. And then we will use S3 in this example. So we need to have the right provider. Up here in the DAG comments, I actually list which providers you need. And if you're using the Astro CLI like me, this is as easy as just adding the provider to your requirements file. Back to the DAG. Now I define 2 variables. I have the base source. So this is where I have my files stored, where I want to get them from. And I have the base destination. And you can see up here, this is actually part of the code that Mark showed in the slides. This is the very simple way you can define your object storage path. So I need to have a URI, and you know the URI starts with a description of your file system. So if I use Amazon S3, it will be S3. If I use the local file system, it will be file, then a colon // and then the path to the base. In this case, I'm using the bucket name. So I have a very basic path, but I can later append different locations inside of S3. Of course, you know, S3 isn't actually folders, it's just a key path, but we can imagine them as folders and interact with them as almost folders. And the other object storage path that I'm defining is the destination. In this case, it's just local. This is built in. You don't need a provider for it. And I can say, well, I want to have the file, and then I want to save the files in include and the folder poems, because I'm actually fetching poems from this upstream repository. The last thing you need is the connection ID. Here, the connection ID to AWS. And here, if you use the local file system, you don't need a connection ID. If you're new to Airflow and don't know much about connections, join next week's webinar. That's a whole hour just about connections. All right, and now you can probably see the beauty of this new feature, because let's imagine a day later, we are changing the location of our poems, or we say, well, we want to have a similar DAG, the same tasks, but we are interacting with Azure Blob Storage or with Google Cloud Storage, or we want to move something from Azure Blob Storage to S3. The only thing that you need to change are the variables up here. And of course, you could also have those in a configuration file, so you don't even need to touch your DAG file, and nothing in the code itself changes. There's a tiny asterisk here. There are some methods on this object storage path that don't work with all of the object storage implementations. That's a limitation of the underlying services. So there's some things that don't work with S3 or don't work with GCS. So in that case, you would still need to change something in the DAG code. But for most of the commonly used methods, this should be interoperable. All right, so we have up 2 object storage paths. Let's see how I use them in the tasks. And Mark mentioned this. This is all very Pythonic, and I also love writing DAGs in the Pythonic way. But if you prefer the traditional operators, object storage path also has something for you in store that I'm going to show in a second. So here you can see our 3 tasks. The first one is a regular task. I pass in a base path, in this case, the source path. And here you can see I can simply append, I'll call it a folder, I know it's not technically a folder, to my base path to say, well, I want to list everything in the poems folder. Then I have my full path. I make it iterable. I make the directory iterable with .itdir. And then I say, well, for every file in that directory, for every F, every item in the file, if that F is a file, so if this returns true, f.isFile returns true, there's also f.isDirectory. Then I want to list it in a new list called files. So I have this small list comprehension. And then I return my new list, which is a list of object storage path objects. So by returning this in a task flow task, you can also already tell this is serializable even with standard XCOM. So you don't need to worry about a custom XCOM backend to pass object storage paths in between your Airflow tasks. Now I have my list of object storage paths. Now I want to dynamically map my tasks. So I have both of my downstream tasks, copy file to local and read file content. And if you remember, those are the tasks that adapt at runtime. So if I have 2 files, like in this case, there will be 2 copies of each of those tasks. If I have 1,000 files the next day, someone wrote a lot of poems overnight, then I can have 1,000 map task instances. And this is quite simple. I will just touch on dynamic task mapping very lightly here. We have a full-length webinar on the topic, so of course there's much more to it. But if you just are using Taskflow API tasks, it's as simple as instead of calling it directly, like I did with the first task, I use a method called .partial. Here, everything goes in that will be the same in every dynamically mapped task. So it's always the same destination. I always want to write the poems to this folder. And then I click .expand. And this is everything that changes. So I say, well, that file, that one object storage path, that should change and should be an item in that list of object storage paths. So this means I copy, and this is probably my favorite line in this demo. This is how you can stream copy a file from one destination to another. It uses shutil.copy object under the hood. But it's extremely simple. You just say file.copy, and then you give it a destination. And there you go. It copies the file. No matter how big, it will stream it under the hood. Of course, there are more arguments you can pass to shutil copy object, but this is all you need to copy your files around. Absolutely awesome. If you've ever dealt with copying large files before, you know how great this is. The second task reads the file. I could have used read.text because it's just a text file, but I wanted to show you that it actually works with the bytes directly. So no matter if you have a picture or a video or audio, you can read the bytes out and then you can decode them and do whatever you need to do with them. So if you're doing ML pipelines with pictures, with image recognition, things like that, this will be super useful to you. And then in this case, I just return the text. For the copy file, I can show you that it works by opening this folder. We have our 2 poems copied in here. And for the reading the files, I just return it. So you can actually see it returned in the task logs, or something that is also new in Airflow 2.8. You can now see the XCOMs in this new XCOM tab, which is one of my favorite UI improvements. And then you can here read Der Panther from Rainer Maria Rilke if you want to. All right, so this was the simple implementation of object storage. But of course, there is much, much more to it. And I have a DAG here. It's called Object Storage Showcase. And this DAG has a couple of tasks just showing you different things you can do with this object storage path class. I can show you the code right here. If Zoom has a notification in my way, so now. Same start, same implementation. Actually, I'm using the same files. In this case, I append the poems directory in the base path. So I'm saying I already know with this base, I'm only interacting with files in this folder anyway, so I can put it in the base. I connect it to S3 and I'm ready to go. And if I ever change this to be on GCS Azure, I just need to change these variables. I don't need to change much of the DAG code or none at all, depending on which method I'm using. The first task is the same. I just list the files. I also, again, print out the content. And then there's this long task, and I will not go through all of the code here, but this shows different properties that you have on this object storage path. So this is for you to explore, see what is useful. You can print this out with your own files if you aim it at your own files, and then you know which kind of information you can get and use in your DAG code. It mostly uses the same API as FSSpec. So you can look at their documentation, or you can look at the pathlib documentation. You should be able to use shutil, as you've already seen, with that class. So it's free for you to experiment. I just tried out a couple that I thought were very useful. But yeah, there's a ton that you can do with this. And as I already mentioned, sometimes there are limits to the backend. For example, that same file does not work with AWS, as I found out while I was writing this code. Okay, things to highlight here, you can get a ton of attributes. What I really liked was uKey and checksum. This gives you a hash, so you can actually check for file changes if you store that hash and then you retrieve it the next time your task runs. So a lot of things that you can do with that. And another very useful one that I found is you can pull the full URI from it. And of course, isFile and isDir if you want to separate out subdirectories from files from a location. Down here, you also have examples on how to rename a file, create a new one, write to a new file, and delete a file. So feel free to copy this code into your own DAGs. This is all there for you to use. And if you do something really cool with it, tell us, and we might be able to put it on the Airflow Medium. All right, so this is all of the other things that you can do just with the base object storage path. But Mark already mentioned, you can add more backends. And one example is here in this DAG, the FTP backend. So if you want to attach any other backend, and this should work with any FSSpec backend. If it doesn't with one that you need, please tell us in the Airflow Slack. The feature is still experimental, so there might be still a couple of kinks or things that people haven't tested yet, but it definitely works with FTP. You import this attach function from Airflow IO store. You give it a protocol name, you give it the file system implementation, which in this case needs a host. And this is actually an open FTP server, so I can connect to it anonymously, and you can also run this DAG without needing to provide any connection. And then I define my base path. I navigate to the pub folder on this server, and then I can run my code. And if I ever need to change the FTP server or where I am, I just do this up here. Don't need to change any of the code. There are two tasks in this DAG. The first one actually prints out all of the currently implemented FSSpec implementations. So, because I assume some of you might be thinking now, well, does it exist for what I'm using? This is how you will know. And the other one just reads information from this one location to prove that this works. One thing that you can see here is that if you retrieve a file from this object storage path, so this just retrieves, I add the file path directly. So this will be the file at FTP pub index text. I can actually open this as you're used to opening files in a context manager and then read from it directly. In the DAG code, I can hop over here. Not that interesting as a DAG. I'm not going to go over the DAG graph here. But you can see there's actually a lot of different implementations in FSpec that you can attach to this new feature. And you can also see that reading from it works. All right. One last DAG for the object storage feature. It's just a huge feature, so I had to separate it out into several DAGs. I said earlier, if you don't like task flow, if you prefer traditional operators, we will still have something for you. And that is the file transfer operator. Very simple DAG, just one task. And if we hop over into the DAG code, you can see this is a traditional operator. It's actually part of a provider, so this is not part of core Airflow. The provider is called the Common I/O provider. It's very new. And you also need to add or install this in your Airflow environment to be able to use this operator. But once you have it installed, you just import it. And then you can see down here, implement it as any normal operator. You just need to give it a source and a destination, and then it will stream copy your file. It actually uses the same .copy method that I showed earlier under the hood, but you don't need to think about it. You don't need to think about the Python method or code. You just say, well, from my source destination, which is, I actually am just copying it from one to another location in the same S3 bucket here. But you could use, again, from Azure to GCS, from local file system to Azure, whatever you want. Or you can even attach your other backends and try if that works, if that is interoperable. And yeah, it's pretty simple in terms of implementation. You can also, instead of providing a connection ID and the path, you can also just only provide the path as an object storage path. So that's the other option you have, especially if you're attaching backends. This will be necessary. And also a little tip, if you're copying from one implementation, so S3 to S3, GCS to GCS, just moving files around, then it will use the optimal path and the data is not passed for the worker, which is a really cool added feature, makes it a lot faster. All right, that was all about the object storage. I know that was a lot, but there's other features in this Airflow release. So the first one I want to show you is the listener. And I'm actually super curious if you want to put in the chat, have you used listeners before? Because they've been around for a while, but not really that publicized, or not. I heard a lot of people who didn't know about them. Okay, I see one person saying no. Ah, Mario has used them. Scott, no. Okay, several people who say no or not yet. Okay, so great.
Here we go.
So
here we go. Here we go.
Katja has. Okay, I saw 3 yes, I think. A bit fast. Mateus, great.
Yeah, maybe.
Cheryl, okay, cool. Very cool if you used them before. I had not used them much before this feature came out. So I'm going to show you how to implement 2 of them actually. One has already existed and one is new. And as Mark explained, the basic idea of a listener in Airflow is that you have a process running in the background that is listening, that's why they're called listeners, to a certain event. And this task, or like this process, is not part of any DAG or any task specifically, but part of your whole Airflow environment. And I see a question if it's the same as file sensors. No, it's actually quite different because a file sensor is a task in a DAG. So you need a DAG to be running. You could, well, would probably be a little hacky. You could try to implement something similar with a sensor, but then you need that DAG to always be running. But with listeners, it's really Airflow native. And the way you do that is actually via a plugin, where I'm going to show the code in a second. But I said I implemented 2 listeners for this Airflow environment. And maybe if some of you are very like eagle-eyed, you've seen something in the logs that is normally not there. So this is the other poem. In this case, it is The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. But that's not what I wanted to show you. It's this line here. Actually, zoom in a little. You can see it a little better. There's a line here in the logs that says, I am always listening for any task instance to start running, and I heard that. And in my code, there was no print statement that says that. So this print statement was actually printed by a listener. That's the listener that already existed, or one of them that already existed, that runs whenever any task instance is running in your whole DAG. But there are new ones. There are actually 2 new ones. If I look at the docs, those are all the listeners that currently exist. And on dataset created and on dataset changed are the 2 ones that were added in Airflow 2.8. So let's look at the one that is working with a dataset, because that one is really cool. I have 2 DAGs here. One is called, not that creatively, Producer DAG, and one is called Consumer DAG. And those DAGs are connected via a dataset. So this DAG has one task. Look at the task here. And this task, it just fetches an image from, actually an image of a bear from an API. And this task will update a dataset. If you haven't used datasets yet, this will probably be a little fast for you, but we also have a full guide on the topic of datasets, and it's one of the best ways to schedule a DAG. So definitely learn about them if you haven't. But if you've used them before, this is familiar to you. You have the outlets parameter and you set them to a list of datasets. And in this case, the dataset, I've actually used the same URI in the dataset and in the object storage path. So another way to make your DAGs more modular. So this will update the dataset called file include bears. If we look at the datasets tab, you can see that as soon as this dataset is updated, the consumer DAG will start running. And I can show you that. I can actually start the producer DAG, and you can see it at the bottom of the screen. As soon as the task finishes successfully, my consumer DAG started running. So you can see this is how you can structure your whole Airflow instance without needing to figure out how long DAGs are taking. So I highly recommend using that. But what is the listener part? So if I go into the code, the listener, I said it before, is defined as an Airflow plugin. So we need to go down to the plugins folder, and you can see I have 2 files here. This is the file where I register my plugin. So I instantiate a new class inheriting from the plugin class, the Airflow plugin class. And then I can just add listeners to the listener attribute. So in this case, I just give it my listener code. If you're interested in general in Airflow plugins, they're a great way to build on top of Airflow. We have a guide on how to interact with plugins and what other types of plugins there are. But in this case, I just want to add a listener to this plugin and import this code. This is in my second file here. And this is all of the code that I need in. Down here, you can see the very simple listener that is running every time a task instance is running. So I'm using the statement on task instance running, which is one of the statements listed in the Airflow documentation, to say, well, this is running in the background, and every time a task instance starts running, execute this code. And this can be any code. In this case, I just print something to the task logs. But in the case of the dataset changed, I have a bit more of code. So I'm saying whenever any dataset is changed, so an update to a dataset is produced, print this statement, always listening for any dataset changes, and then actually instantiate a Slack hook so you can use all of your Airflow tools in here, so all of your hooks and your connections. And I'm sending a text to my Slack environment that a dataset was changed. I can actually hop over. This is my sandbox Slack. And you can see, for me, it's 8:41 p.m. And this was the dataset. This was sent by the listener just now when I triggered the DAG. But you might be thinking, well, I want to listen for a lot of datasets, but I have some rules around them. I only want something specific to happen for datasets that, for example, are about bears, because you have a lot of data about bears. I hope everyone should have. So you can actually use the dataset URI in conditional logic within this listener hook. So I can say if the URI, in this case, I'm saying, well, only if the URI is exactly this, run more code. And in this case, if it's about the bears dataset, which by the way, nothing to do with Airflow, but these are the bears, very important. If it's that dataset, I want to calculate how many days are left until Fat Bear Week. So then this task part is running. And I can actually show you that this worked. Anything that you print inside of a listener hook will be printed to the task that is causing it to run. So in this case, you can look at the logs here. You can see after the task was successful, then the update to the dataset was made, and then the listener started firing. So you always listen for dataset changes. We post to Slack, that happened. And then it realizes that's the bears dataset. Bears are awesome. And Fat Bear Week is in approximately 267 days. I don't think they announced the concrete date yet, at least not when I wrote these DAGs. All right. So that's about listeners. If you want to learn more about them, we actually have a tutorial, and I can post this into the chat. This walks you through it step by step, because I know if you've never used an Airflow plugin before, it can be a little confusing at first. But if you follow this tutorial, you will be able to implement your own listener. All right. The third bigger new feature is actually something that's not that easy to demo because something needs to go wrong for it. So that's why we have a Faildag here. It's the forwarding of the error logs. So if we click into this DAG, you can see I have a task here that I called memory intensive tasks. It just creates a huge array. Don't do this. It is way too much for my little laptop. So you can actually see it ran for 49 seconds. But what happened was it got killed. I got the info that the task exited with the return code -9. This stands for sick kill, externally killed. So something killed my task. But before Airflow 2.8, I wouldn't have known what that was because this is where my logs would have ended. Now in Airflow 2.8, and this required a lot of work inside of Airflow on the Airflow backend to change how the logging works of components, I can actually tell what happened. And you can watch for this name of the logger. It's the task context logger. And this is forwarded from the scheduler logs. So this is especially useful if you don't have access to your scheduler logs, if that is separated out in your Airflow environment, or if you don't want to look through them for a specific error. Because this just forwards the specific error that caused this task to fail. In this case, because the task ran out of memory, because we had a way too big array, it turned into a zombie, and the schedulers don't like zombies, noticed the zombie, and then terminated the zombie, and that's how the task got sick killed. This also works if a celery task is stuck in queue, and in the future, probably for even more implementations. Yeah, also any externally killed task, actually. So also if your scheduler dies. All right. Those were the big features. We have a couple of additional ones that are really awesome. One that Mark already mentioned is we have new branching options. So you probably know the task.branch decorator or the Python branch operator. And those are two options how you can make your Airflow logic conditional. So you can say, I define my DAG, but I'm not running the same tasks every time. You can make which task to run depending on outside input, or what I'm doing here, it's actually random. So this is a DAG that's supposed to help me to figure out what to have for dinner after this webinar. So let's run this DAG. And you can see here, I don't know in advance what it's going to pick. It decided I should have potatoes, and then it starts cooking. Now it decides on vegetable. That actually failed, but did work the last time. I think something with the VM probably went wrong. And the second one, it decides on a vegetable. And in that case, it decided spinach. But for example, in the first time I ran it, it told me to get broccoli. All right, so how does this look like in my code? Let's open the VM branching example. You can see here that I don't need to import anything other because I'm using the task decorator, so I can just use the different decorators from this. And this first one is the one that already existed at task.branch. So I'm deciding which food I'm using. And if you used any branch operators before, you know that you need to return the task ID of the task that's supposed to run downstream. So I return by my base food. And in this case, it just chooses randomly using the random package, and then it runs the task that it was chosen. And if you've used branch operators before, you know that the task downstream of that needs to have the trigger rule none failed, minimum 1 success. Otherwise, it might be skipped. And this is what's new. We have now the virtual env. So we can say add tasks.branch virtual env. And then we can actually define a virtual environment and give it requirements directly in here. So this task will run outside of your normal Airflow environment. So for example, if you're using NumPy 1.20 in your general Airflow environment, but this task really needs NumPy 1.24.4, you can do that. You will not have a package conflict. Of course, there's also a general virtual env environment. You don't need to branch with it. That has existed for a while. But this is now the new feature in Airflow 2.8. You can do this with branching. So I can use NumPy here, and I know I have the version pinned, and I can return the vegetable that it randomly chose. And in the end, again, don't forget the trigger rule. One of the most common mistakes, and a mistake I still often make when I write my DAGs, to forget the trigger rule in the task after the branching. The other change that is actually listed as a significant change, and I already mentioned DAG docs, is that formally, if you had your DAG docs with raw HTML, that just worked, and now you need to enable that specifically. What do we mean by raw HTML? If you look at the docs of this DAG, you can see I actually use color in this. This is not possible in native Markdown. This is possible because I use HTML, and I also resized this image using HTML. And it says here, you need to set this Airflow environment variable, or this Airflow config. I can show you how I do that in the code. You can do that any way that you set your Airflow environment configs. I decided to do it in the Docker file. I set it to true here. So if you want to use raw HTML in your DAG descriptions or in your params descriptions, which is a lesser known use, then you now need to set this to true. So this is very important. If you're using that, you need to update this. You can see two more interesting Airflow config variables here. Some of you may have noticed that the colors have changed in my Airflow environment. This is normally not light blue, even if you're using Astronomer. This doesn't have to do with the Astro CLI. We didn't change the colors. And the font is normally white. So it's not dark normally. So what did I do? I set the navbar color. This was actually possible for a couple of versions now. What is new in Airflow 2.8 is I can set the navbar text color. One of those small things, you can now really truly have your favorite colors up here, because you can also change the text. So if you want to have a very light background, it will be readable now. All right. I think that was most of what that I wanted to show. One last thing. I showed you the XCOM tab already, but this is actually extremely beautiful when you have a DAG that pushes several things to XCOM under different keys. Then it will give you this little table with all of your XCOM. And yeah, I absolutely love that, because I look at the XCOMs every single day. So this tab is a great improvement for me personally. All right. So other significant changes that I did not show, there is a new DAG run clear number attribute that tracks how many times a DAG run has been cleared. So this could be useful. Maybe you are an admin of an Airflow environment and you want to know if one of your users keeps clearing the same DAG, like after 10 times, you want to get a notification. That's one thing that you could do with that. You can add descriptions to your pools now that are shown in the UI. So you can tell your colleagues what a pool is actually for. Don't have to have those long names anymore, trying to be as descriptive as possible. There's a new previous end date success method. In the context, this is a little bit more technical. So you can actually have a task, have dependent logic on when that task last ended successfully, which can be very useful. And if you have a DAG with none as the schedule, you can now also set the start date to none. So you don't have to pick a random day anymore. All right. Of course, check out the full release notes for more and all of the details. And with that, I think we're ready to take questions.
Okay, thanks, Tamara, for going through all of that. That was an awesome demo. We have had tons of audience engagement. I'm really excited that people have lots of great questions about all of these new features. Mark and I have been answering a lot of them in the chat, but there are a couple that I want to address live that we haven't gotten to, or that I want to kind of touch on again. The first was, this was going back a ways, but somebody asked, is there an XCOM backend using the object store feature? The answer is no, not yet, but this is listed in the AIP as future work. So this is not me promising you that that will exist, but it was brought up as a potential improvement. Again, the object store is new, it's experimental feature. I would expect additional work on this in the future, and that was identified as a great next step, something that this will be well suited towards. So keep an eye out for future releases. Can you monitor a Redshift table and trigger a DAG on a data change? This is a great question. I will take the start of this one and then I'll pass it to you guys. The answer is kind of, but probably not in the way that you're asking. Airflow datasets or the object storage as they work today are not designed to monitor an external service like that. They're relatively contained within Airflow. So there's no way to just point it and say, like, run my DAG when this table has updated based on just the dataset URI or a connection that you pass to the object store. That being said, there are other ways, obviously, to implement something like the use case that was described. I don't actually know what the state is of sensors that are designed for Redshift specifically. There might be some. The other way that I've seen this done is if what is updating your table is an Airflow task, then you can absolutely do that with the data set. So that is one way. That is also some very frequently asked question of whether Airflow can monitor external services in that way, and has been discussed within the community as a potential future state for data sets. So again, I'll say stay tuned for more developments there. Okay, Tamara, I'm going to give this question to you. Can a data set be a file in S3 or an FTP server or an object storage path? So maybe you want to touch on how, clarify what a data set is and what the URI means, and then how that interacts with the object storage path today.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think those two features, datasets and object storage, are very easy to conflate. I think let me share my screen again. And I think in the Bears dataset, I'm actually using both of them on purpose so you can see how they differ. You should see my Airflow environment again and not my screenshots. Okay, so you can see here, those are actually two very separate features. The datasets feature you can kind of imagine it currently as a way of raising flags. Like in my mind, I see all of those tasks and some of them complete successfully. And the tasks that have that outlets parameter defined, whenever they complete successfully, they wave a little flag to your whole Airflow instance and say, hey, I was successful. This is an update to a data set. And then any DAG that is scheduled on the data set, so this is always a full DAG, it can't be a specific task, starts running. So the DAGs that are scheduled on data sets, like this one, those are watching for those little flags. And this is the main thing about data sets. So the data sets themselves, we use a URI in them to identify them, but this is actually currently, just a convention. I could call this bears are so great, and it would still work as long as I have the same string in the data set that is at the outlets parameter and the other data set that I schedule on. Like on the consuming side, I just pass the exact same data set with the same string to the schedule parameter. That's the datasets feature. Now, the object storage path feature is actually much more connected to your data and to your actual files, because this one is actually connecting to that file. So in this case, I'm using the object storage path, and you can see, yes, I'm using the same URI because this is a real URI to a real location. And this will actually connect there, and you will be able, like in this case, I'm using it to write something to it. You will be able to interact with files at that location. What I'm doing here is I'm saying I have this base. So I have this file in my local folder, or like this is a folder in my include folder. I add the name of the file. I want to have a bear.jpg there. And then I make sure that the base exists, make sure that that folder exists. And then I write the bytes that I just pulled from an API to that location, name it bear.jpg. So you can see here, I can interact with my files much more. And if I use the base, I just need the URI, but you saw that earlier in this one shows it. If I'm actually using a remote storage, I need to provide a connection. So I need to provide all of my credentials. With a data set, you're not providing any connections, and that's how you can kind of tell it apart. Because if you're not providing your credentials, how would the data set be able to connect? That all said, I know there's a ton of work being done on the datasets feature and of course on the object storage path as well. So maybe in the future, they are even more interoperable and that things get more data aware. We'll see where the feature will go.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Tamara. I know we're at time, folks. So there's one more question I just want to address really quickly. Somebody asked, how can they configure an environment using 2.8 that is scalable? That's a really awesome question, a whole can of worms in itself. But I just want to say that that your mileage will vary a lot depending on how you have Airflow set up. This is what Astronomer does, is provide a managed scalable Airflow solution. I'm going to throw the link to our free trial in the chat. So consider checking that out and definitely reach out to us if you're interested there. I know we're a couple of other questions, but we are at time. So thanks everybody so much for joining us. You will get the recording again, as well as that will include a link to the repo that has all of the DAGs that Tamara went through. So you will have the source code available to you as well as the recording of this presentation. So we really appreciate you all joining us for our first webinar of 2024. We love going through the new Airflow releases with you. We learned a ton, including that there are no bears on the island that Mark lives, which is very sad for Mark, obviously. So we hope to see you again next time. And everybody have a great rest of your day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
See you. Take care.